The first shot cracked through the trees and punched straight through the wooden dummy's helmet, spinning it off the stick and sending it tumbling into the mud. Every man in the patrol froze. Hearts slammed, fingers tightened, and then they realized something that made their blood run cold. That shot hadn't been meant to miss. It was early autumn, 1944, somewhere in the thick forests of Western Europe, where damp leaves swallowed footsteps and every shadow felt like a watching eye. An American infantry squad moved slowly along a narrow trail, rifles ready, nerves stretched thin after weeks of close calls. They were tired, dirty, and running on instinct more than orders. Nothing about the forest felt right. It was too quiet. No birds, no wind, just that heavy, waiting silence that meant trouble. At the front of the line walked a private most of the men barely respected. A skinny kid named Charlie Benton who'd earned a reputation for strange ideas and bad jokes at the worst times. Tied to his pack was a crude mannequin head, carved from wood, painted with mud, and topped with a spare helmet. The others thought it was stupid, dangerous, a waste of time, but Benton kept carrying it anyway, because he believed it might keep them alive. Quick thing before we continue, hit subscribe if you want more incredible World War II stories like this. Because at WW2 Vault we dig up the moments that sound fake until you realize they actually happened. What the squad didn't know was that the forest ahead was crawling with German soldiers who had been waiting all morning for exactly this kind of patrol. They'd set up an ambush with overlapping fields of fire, rifles resting on logs, fingers steady, eyes locked on the trail. They were patient, trained, and confident, because they'd done this before and watched entire groups vanish in seconds. One clean shot would start it all. That morning had started like any other for the Americans, with cold rations eaten in silence and orders passed down from a captain who looked just as tired as the rest of them. Their mission was simple on paper but dangerous in practice. Move through the forest, check for enemy activity, report back. Intelligence had suggested the area was clear, but intelligence had been wrong before, and the men knew it. They'd lost friends to bad information, to ambushes that weren't supposed to be there, to forests that looked empty until they weren't. Benton had been carving the mannequin head for 3 days, whittling away at a chunk of wood he'd found near an abandoned farmhouse, using his knife during breaks when the others smoked or tried to sleep. Some of the men had asked what he was doing, and when he explained, they'd laughed. The sergeant had called it the dumbest thing he'd ever seen. One corporal said it was bad luck, like Benton was carving his own grave marker. But Benton didn't care what they thought, because back home in Pennsylvania he'd spent years hunting deer with his father, learning how animals moved, how they reacted to danger, how a single mistake could mean going home empty-handed or worse. His father had taught him that deer would freeze at the snap of a twig, that they'd watch for movement before deciding whether to run or stay hidden. Benton had seen the same behavior in combat. German snipers didn't just shoot at anything. They waited for the right target, the perfect moment, the clear shot that wouldn't give away their position unless it was worth it. A helmet moving above cover, a head peeking around a tree. That split second of exposure was all they needed. So Benton figured if he could give them that target without risking a real man, maybe he could turn their patience against them. Maybe he could make them reveal themselves before anyone got hurt. The idea wasn't complicated, but it required believing that the enemy would fall for something so simple. And most of the squad didn't believe anything about war was simple anymore. The German soldiers waiting in the forest that morning were veterans of the Eastern Front. Men who'd survived years of brutal fighting against the Soviets and had been rotated west to rest and regroup. They knew how to read terrain, how to pick ambush sites where every angle favored them and every escape route led into more danger. Their commander, a hard-eyed corporal named Friedrich Weber, had positioned his men in a semicircle along the trail, spacing them far enough apart that one American grenade couldn't take out multiple soldiers, close enough that their fields of fire overlapped and created a killing zone with no safe spots. Weber had done this 17 times in the past 4 months, and 17 times his squad had walked away without a scratch while Allied patrols were carried out on stretchers or left behind for grave registration. He'd learned to be patient, to let the enemy walk deep into the trap before springing it, because the first shot was everything. If you missed or fired too early, the element of surprise died and suddenly you were in a fair fight, and fair fights got people killed. Weber never wanted a fair fight. He wanted a massacre. That shot came when Benton raised the mannequin above the path, just enough to look like a helmeted head peeking forward to check what lay ahead. Weber's best sniper, a thin man named Klaus who'd once shot a Russian officer from 800 meters, saw the helmet and didn't hesitate. He'd been waiting for 2 hours, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, his breathing slow and controlled. The target appeared exactly where he expected it, moving the way careless soldiers always moved, and he squeezed the trigger with the confidence of a man who'd never missed an important shot. The crack of the rifle shattered the quiet, and Klaus watched through his scope as the helmet spun away and something fell. He smiled. Perfect shot. First kill. Then he heard screaming, but not the kind of screaming he expected. No one was calling for a medic. No one was crying out in pain. Someone was yelling contact, 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 and suddenly the Americans weren't dying in the open like they were supposed to. They were diving for cover, moving fast, disappearing behind trees and logs like they'd known exactly where the shot would come from. Benton dropped flat and screamed contact, and this time no one laughed. The squad scattered off the trail, diving behind trees and fallen logs as bullets tore through leaves and bark where their bodies would have been seconds earlier. Training kicked in. Fear sharpened focus. And for the first time that day, the Germans lost the element they needed most. Surprise. The sergeant, whose name was Frank Morrison and who'd been fighting since North Africa, realized immediately what had happened. That first shot should have killed someone. Should have dropped a man in the trail and started the panic. Instead it had hit a decoy, and now his squad knew there were enemy soldiers ahead and roughly where at least one of them was hiding. Morrison had been in enough ambushes to know that surprise was everything, and without it, the Germans had just lost their biggest advantage. He started barking orders, his voice cutting through the chaos, telling his men to spread out, return fire, keep moving. 2 soldiers with Browning automatic rifles opened up, spraying the trees where they'd seen muzzle flash, forcing the Germans to stay down. Another man crawled forward with grenades, looking for a position where he could lob them into the enemy's cover. And Benton, still lying flat in the dirt with his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs, grabbed what was left of his mannequin and started thinking about how to use it again. Minutes earlier, the squad had been moving blind, unsure where danger waited. Now they knew exactly where at least one enemy gun sat, because the shot had given it away. Benton crawled forward, heart pounding, and shoved the mannequin up again from a different angle, this time from behind a thick oak tree that gave him cover. Another shot rang out. Another flash. Another position revealed. Klaus was frustrated now, confused, because he'd seen the helmet fall and he knew that shot had been perfect, but somehow the Americans were still fighting, still organized, and now they were shooting back with accuracy that suggested they knew exactly where he was. He fired at the second helmet, watched it jerk and disappear, and only then did he realize something was wrong. Real men didn't move like that. Real heads didn't jerk back without bodies following. He'd been shooting at decoys. The Germans were confused. They'd expected screams, panic, bodies falling in the open. Instead, they faced disciplined fire snapping back from hidden Americans who suddenly knew where to aim. The forest erupted with noise as both sides exchanged shots, but the ambush had failed, and that changed everything. Weber cursed under his breath and made a decision. The Americans weren't running. They weren't dying. They were maneuvering, and that meant grenades would be coming soon, flanking movements, maybe even a radio call for artillery. His men were good, but they weren't set up for a prolonged fight against an enemy who knew they were there. He gave the order to fall back, to break contact and withdraw deeper into the forest where they could regroup and set up somewhere else. The squad leader, Morrison, shouted orders and started flanking left, using the trees as cover. One by one, the Americans shifted, keeping low, moving smart, while Benton stayed behind, lifting the fake head again and again, drawing fire, counting shots, marking positions in his mind. It was insane. It was brave. And it worked. German soldiers began pulling back, unsure how many Americans they faced, shaken by the fact that their clean kill had turned into a mess. When grenades started landing near their positions, exploding with sharp cracks that sent dirt and splinters flying, they broke contact entirely, fading deeper into the woods and leaving the trail behind. The firefight ended as suddenly as it began. Smoke drifted, leaves settled, and the squad slowly regrouped, checking each other for wounds they somehow didn't have. Not a single man was hit. Not one. Morrison walked over to Benton, stared at the shattered wooden head lying in the dirt, and shook his head slowly. He didn't apologize. He didn't smile. He just said he'd never call another idea stupid again. Then he picked up the broken piece of wood, looked at the bullet hole punched clean through it, and told Benton to make another one because from now on, every patrol was carrying a dummy. Word spread quietly after that. Another unit borrowed the idea when they heard what happened. Then another. Fake helmets on sticks. Old helmets stuffed with rags. Anything to draw fire before a real man stepped forward. It wasn't official doctrine, and no manual ever mentioned it. But it didn't need to be official. It saved lives, and in war, that was the only doctrine that mattered. Some men carved elaborate faces on their decoys. Others just tied helmets to branches. One squad made theirs look so realistic that it fooled their own men during a rotation. The techniques varied, but the principles stayed the same. Make the enemy commit, make them reveal their position, make them waste that crucial first shot on something that couldn't bleed. German soldiers caught on eventually. They started waiting longer, watching for movement below the helmet, looking for bodies attached to the heads they were seeing. But by then the damage was done, because even a few seconds of hesitation was enough to save lives, and the Americans had learned to use those seconds. Years later, veterans would talk about the forest and the ambush that never happened, about how close they came to dying without ever knowing it. They'd remember the sound of that first shot, the moment time froze, and the strange relief of realizing the enemy had fired at a lie instead of a friend. Some of them tried to find Benton after the war, to thank him properly, but he'd moved somewhere out west and didn't stay in touch. Charlie Benton didn't win a medal. His name didn't end up in history books or official after-action reports. He went home after the war, worked a quiet job fixing engines in a small garage, and rarely talked about Europe. When people asked if he'd seen combat, he'd say yes and change the subject. The memories were his own, and he didn't need to share them to know they mattered. But somewhere in those woods, where the trees kept their secrets and the trails still wound through shadows, a simple trick turned the tables on an enemy who thought he had every advantage. It proved that war wasn't always about firepower or training or courage, though all those things helped. Sometimes it was about noticing something small, trusting your gut when everyone else doubted, and having the nerve to look foolish if it meant keeping your friends alive. On that autumn day in 1944, a piece of carved wood and a battered helmet saved an entire squad, and in doing so, proved that survival often belongs to the ones willing to think differently, even when they're surrounded by men who call them stupid. Thanks for watching this story from WW2 Vault. If you want more moments where quick thinking beats deadly odds, hit subscribe, because the next story might sound even crazier than this one. And just like this, it actually happened.